Hello and welcome to the Oxygen Addict podcast. We're brought to you every week by our sponsors precisionfuelandhydration.com. You can personalize your fueling and hydration strategy so you can perform at your best with 15% off your first order of electrolytes and carbohydrate fuel with the code OA23 at precisionfuelandhydration.com. Okay, everybody, welcome to the show. I'm your host, Coach Rob Wilby, and every week I bring you an episode of this podcast to motivate and inspire you. Couple of things I'd like to do for us first before we start. If you like this episode, please like and subscribe on YouTube or follow on your podcast app. That really helps the growth of the channels. And if you're looking for help and advice with your endurance training, please get in touch and let's see if we can be of any help to you. You can email us at help@oxygenaddict.com, or there's a link in the show notes in the podcast or below this on YouTube. It'll go straight through to my calendar, and we can have a chat with you about how we can best help you achieve your endurance goals and the events you've got planned for this year. So without that, let's jump into today's show. I'm going to be talking about how you can conquer hills in Ironman, both on the bike and on the run. I've had tons of questions come through from people. Mainly, I've got to say, from athletes who are doing Ironman UK this year and are really facing the challenge of worrying about the hills they'll face on both the bike and the run. So it's strategies around how you can best plan your training and then best deliver the strategy that you come up with on race day to make sure that you've got enough energy to get through the bike leg and then get to T2 feeling like you can run really, really well off the bike. These strategies are not just aimed at Ironman UK though. Any event that you're doing this year that's got hills in, it's really, really going to help you out. Now, before we go into that, I want to give a shout out to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration. They've got a great online fuel and hydration planning tool you can go to. It's a really great way to get a feel for whether you're a heavy sweater, a salty sweater, and to get a feel for how much carbohydrate you're going to need per hour for your body type and for the kind of event that you're going to be doing this year. There's loads of little sliders you can move around on the screen, and it'll give you a really good read for the concentration of electrolytes you need, because that's how it's the key really to making sure that you stay hydrated. It's not just about how much water you take in, it's about getting the right mix of electrolytes in there as well. It'll also make sure that you get the right amount of carbohydrate in per hour, because all the fitness in the world, unfortunately, isn't going to get you through on its own long distance racing. You have to get the refueling right, and understanding how many grams of carbs you need for your body and the event that you're doing is an essential part of that. So if you want even more information, you can book a free one-to-one video consultation with PFNH's athlete support team, and they'll be happy to help you nail your race nutrition plan and perform at your best come race day. There's a link in the show notes where you can click through and you can book that call with them, or just go and visit precisionfuelandhydration.com. Right then, let's get ourselves into the meat of this week's episode. I've got 8 headline tips here for you that's really going to help you make sure you can be really well prepared for any hilly race that you're doing this year. So number 1 is the importance of mental preparation for the hills you're going to face on race day and hills training. What do I mean by that? We've only got to look at the number of emails that have come through from athletes who are really scared of these hills before they get to them and what effect it's going to have on their race day. And to an extent, they're right. It's important to be really well prepared for the event that you're facing, because although all Ironmans are the same distance, they're not all going to take the same athlete the same amount of time to do. And really hilly ones like Ironman UK and Ironman Wales are probably in the region of an hour longer on the bike than a comparable race like, I don't know, Ironman Austria or Roth or Frankfurt, one of the really fast courses. Partly that's down to the hills, partly that's down to the road surfaces. Largely it's down to just not being able to carry the speed on the downhills and around corners that you would be able to do on either a flat course, or some of the courses I've mentioned there are ones where the climbs are relatively short and sharp, but the downhills are long and shallow. So you carry a lot of the speed is carried down the hill and helps maintain a higher average speed than you'd expect, really. It's the opposite at Ironman UK and Ironman Wales. The uphills, there's lots of them, they're short and sharp, but you can't carry any of that speed on the downhills in lots of places because the bends are blind, it's difficult, the road surface isn't great, you have to be on the brakes a lot. So preparing mentally before you go and do these events is really, really important. So the first thing I'd encourage you to do is visualize success at this. You've chosen these events because they are tough. You've not chosen them because they're going to be fast. So a successful race for almost all athletes does not look like a fast time on these courses. You have to let that idea go out of the window. And if you're a first timer doing these races and you're concentrating on a goal race time, I'd really advise you to let that go. Visualize success being able to run well off the bike and being able to run almost all of the marathon. That's what your success criteria here is. So if you build that in, working backwards onto the bike, successful criteria for riding the bike isn't necessarily a fast bike split. It's a safe bike split where you have no incidents and you get to the end of it. You've had no crashes. You've had no punctures on the downhills. You've dealt with all of the corners and the uphills and the downhills with confidence. So that's a big part of it. And the second thing to think about is the mindset that you'll actually need to tackle the hills with confidence. We're going to go through a lot of these later on, but by the end of this episode, I want you to have a really clear strategy in place for how you're actually going to tackle these hills. And then you'll be really sure how you are going to attempt them on race day. The people who are going to struggle are the people who don't have a plan how to deal with the hills, ride them as if they're in the Tour de France and go really, really hard up the hills on the first lap and are then blown to bits for the rest of it. So that's really worth bearing in mind. The mindset that you need to tackle the hills is one of conserving your energy so that you'll have plenty of energy to get onto the run. Okay. Tip number 2. Let's talk about the proper technique for hill climbing on the bike. So as we're approaching these hills, I want you thinking that the ideal way to go up them, if at all possible, is to stay seated on your bike, not to be up out of the saddle. That's really going to help you. If you can stay seated, you can maintain a steady cadence and you can control the power that you're going up the hill. You are ahead of 90% of the people who are in the race. So the first thing is identifying that strategy to start with. Now, there will be certain hills on these courses where you have to get out of the saddle. But the point I want you making that decision is when you've already used all the gears up that you've got. So as we're approaching any hill, I want you to shift into an easier gear before you reach the hill. And a good tip here is to move up 3 cogs on your cassette at the back as that hill starts. I want you to try and keep your upper body relaxed. I want you to try and sit with your hands either on top of the bars if you're riding a road bike, or in the similar position if you're riding a TT bike. Have your hands there on the base bars and try and ride up the hill relaxed, keeping your upper body relaxed and stable. What we're going to try and avoid is the idea of rocking your body from side to side to try and power your way up the hill. That's if we possibly can, we're going to stay seated. And for a lot of the hills you're going to come across, the longer steady hills, they're actually a bit of a bonus for you. The long, steady hills mean it's very easy for you to control your power. And if you know what your target power numbers are before you go into the race, and you all certainly should do before you go into the race, a long uphill, even a long uphill into a headwind, allows you to control the power that you're putting out really accurately. You might not be going as fast as you'd like to, but it will allow you to control the power. And that's really what this is about. Get out of the mindset of it's about how fast you're traveling and into the mindset of I'm going to control what I can control. And that's the amount of power that I'm putting out. And then you're guaranteed to be set up for success as long as you know how much power you're going to be putting out going up these hills. So we're going to maintain that seated climbing technique for as long as we possibly can. If there are really steep hills there, if you've got to your easiest gear, so the smallest chainring at the front and the biggest cog at the back, and you can't push that comfortably seated at a kind of normal cadence, that's the appropriate point for you to be getting up and out of the saddle and using your weight to move from side to side. But I want that to be a secondary plan almost, away from the first thing you should choose is to stay seated in the saddle, and that's going to be the best way to conserve your energy. Okay, tip number 3 for climbing hills here is let's have the proper technique for hill descending on the bike, and let's have that defined in your heads before you get into the descending itself. So I want you to imagine that as you're heading down the hill, Where you possibly can, we're going to have you carry as much speed as is safe to do so all the times. So we want you in a low aerodynamic position going down the hills. A lot of these courses we've discussed, Wales and UK, they're not appropriate for you to be going downhill on the TT bars in the aero position, but you can get your hands down onto the horns of your aero bar extensions there, and you can use the drops if you're on a road bike, and you can get yourself into a low position. Remember, you want to carry as much speed as you can when it's safe to do so. So get yourself down low and aerodynamically, and staying low is a really good way to go into corners and be really stable going into the corners. So again, if you're on a road bike, get comfortable in training on the drops of the road bike, not with your hands up on the top of the bars or on the hoods of the brakes. Get right down there. If you're on a TT bike, you're going to have to get comfortable descending with your hands down by where the brakes are, because you're going to be able to need to brake. And it's only the very fastest age groupers and those who have seen the course before who are ever going to be anywhere near safe going downhill using their aero bars. So I'd really urge caution in people in choosing that as a strategy. I want you anticipating the turns and any possible potholes. And part of this is being really familiar with the course. I've advised this before to people. Get to your goal race if you possibly can and go for a race course recce. Ride the race. Don't try and do it at race speed or race power. Just ride it and take in what the corners look like, what the entrances and exits to the really steep corners are, if there are any major potholes in places on the roads and where they are, and make a picture of it so that you can avoid them on race day. And then as you're coming into the corner, the way to safely do this is to brake before you go into a corner. And remember, we don't want you sitting up tall going into a corner. We want you staying as low as you possibly can, keeping your center of gravity low. That's going to help you around the corner. But get your braking done before the corner, scrub off the speed before you go into the corner, and then you can accelerate out of the corner on the other way out. What we don't want a situation is where you go into a corner too fast, you have to sit up and hit the brakes halfway around. That's when athletes start getting themselves into trouble. And remember, if at any point you see potholes coming up that you're not sure you're safe to go around, use the brakes as much as you can. Now, that's a big bonus of the strategy of already having your hands on the drops or on the horns. The brakes are right there for you to use, and you can use them to slow down. I would much rather you slow down and avoid potential incidents than try to speed through or do a bunny hop because you've seen pro cyclists do it. Okay, tip number 4 is about strength training for hill climbing in training. How can we get you stronger to climb these hills comfortably? So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to build specific leg strength for more power on the climbs. And the best way to do that is to get out and climb some hills. Now, when I say leg strength, what I'm talking about here is your ability to push force into the pedals as you're climbing seated. And the best way to do that is not to go in the gym and lift weights. The best way to do it is specifically go out and climb hills on your bike like the ones you're going to face on race day. If you can get to the course, brilliant. And if not, spend some time doing some research and work out how steep the climbs are. Get out on some climbs near you locally so you can practice that kind of steepness of climb. The best way to build that leg strength is by actually climbing the hills at the power, the cadence that you're going to do on race day. Okay? A more advanced technique for this, and here we're looking at our stronger age groupers and those who are more experienced. I would really get beginners and people who are from a running background and people who are least experienced bikers to stay away from this second strategy. You can push a bigger gear than usual on a climb deliberately. So anywhere in the range of 10 to 30 revs a minute lower than your usual riding cadence. If you do that, if you push that lower cadence than usual, what you'll find is that's really excellent at developing this idea of pushing force into the pedals, and that will deliver specific leg strength. And again, I'm using the word strength here to mean its literal physiological definition of the ability to push more force into the pedals. So if you train like this, great. You can go out onto the hills for our more experienced riders and push these big gear, low cadence up hills. For those of you who are not in that group, a safer way to do this is to do it either on a flat road, maybe into a headwind, or to do it on the turbo indoors and do a similar thing. Do a big gear, low cadence interval session. So you might start with 1 minute of pushing a gear that's much bigger than usual at, I don't know, let's say between 20 and 30 revs a minute, slower than your usual cadence. So if your usual cadence is 90, you're looking at between 60 and 70. You can gradually work that cadence down across a number of weeks, maybe 10 revs a minute lower to get down to that target. And you can also make sure that you start with maybe 1 minute of that interval out of every 5 minutes and increase it to 2, 3, and eventually get to the point you're doing 5 minutes out of every 10. You won't get very out of breath doing big gear intervals because it's shifting the load from your lungs and heart into your legs, but you can expect to feel very fatigued. And the day after the ride, especially, your legs will feel much more fatigued than you'd expect them to. That's just part of these big gear intervals. The last thing I would say here, the strength training for hill climbing, is if you're doing these outdoors, try and do them at an appropriate effort for Ironman or 70.3 as you will on race day. So for the really steep hills on race day, I'm going to say you want to try and cap your power at 100% of FTP. So if your FTP is 200 watts, you never want to see 220, 230, 240 on your power meter. You really want to do your best to try and cap those numbers. On the long, steady climbs, I'd advise capping them at below 90% if you possibly can. Now, there's going to be some hills where you just have to do whatever you can do to get yourself up those hills. There are some really steep ones at Ironman UK and at Wales. There, we'll talk about a little strategy for that a little bit later on. But when you possibly can, keep that power under 100% on the steep hills and under 90% on the long, steady hills. That's just a really good way to measure your power out across the ride. Okay, so as well as doing specific training for power and strength for the hills, tip number 5 is around endurance training for hill climbing. So we've talked there about developing leg strength. Let's talk about developing cardiovascular endurance for sustained efforts on long climbs. The best way to do this, again, is to do it in the real world. Get outside and ride hills, ideally long, steady climbs. Ride them with your power meter and get a feel for what happens when you start to ride uphill. And what's going to happen is you will naturally put out more power than you think you should be doing. So if you're usually riding at 75% on the flats, you'll find you're riding at 85 or 90% on the hills. So there's two things about this. That's going to be really good cardiovascular development training. And I include this in my athletes' long rides, long hilly rides outdoors. But the reason we're doing it is to learn to try and control that power and gradually bring it down. Because I'm sure you can see, if you're including effectively intervals of 20 minutes at 90% of FTP during your Ironman, you are not setting yourself up for a successful run. So doing some of this in training, especially in the early days, is a great way to help build cardiovascular endurance. But the main purpose of it is you're learning to not do this on race day and learning to control the power as much as you can. And an ideal situation will be that your power doesn't really increase much on those uphills on race day, more than 5 or maybe 10% above what your top of power cap should be anyway. So for someone whose power should be someone whose power on race day should be 70%, we don't really want to see more than 80% on those long climbs, and similar for other power targets as well. So make sure that you can incorporate that hill training into your training so you know what you're doing come race day. The next thing to talk about here, involved in endurance training, is getting the correct gears on your bike, because that's a massive part of it. A lot of bikes these days are now coming with compact chain sets at the front and bigger cassettes on the back, and that's great. If you are doing a hilly race this year, it's in your interests to have the smaller of the compact chain rings at the front and the biggest gears at the back that your derailleur can take. Consult with your bike shop on this. Some of you might be in a position, especially if you're on an older bike, you might have to change your rear derailleur to a medium or a long cage derailleur so it can take the more modern, bigger cassettes at the back. It's quite common these days to be able to get a 32 cog road cassette on the back. That is a fantastic cassette for you to have. It means you're going to have a bigger range of hills that you can get up comfortably and seated. So talk to your local bike shop about this. If you change your cassette, you are going to have to change your chain as well, change them over and match them, and make sure that they all match and that they're all working smoothly together. I'd set you a target of having that done at the very latest 4 weeks before race day. You don't want to be changing stuff closer than 4 weeks before race day. Tip number 6 here is our effective use of gears to climb the hills. Now we've talked about changing the gears. Let's talk about how to use them. We need to know when to shift the gears for the maximum efficiency going up the hill. So as soon as you roll onto the hill and you start to go up, you'll naturally start to slow down. Immediately change up 3 gears to make it 3 gears easier at the back. And then try and maintain your cadence without a feeling of increasing how much you're pushing, or without an increase on the power meter showing. And as you start to notice an increase in power, or you feel an increase in how hard you've got to push, gradually change up to bigger and bigger cassettes across the back as you go. And that way, what you can try and do is kind of level out the fluctuations in power and effort that are naturally going to happen as you go up the hills. I want you to aim to get into your easiest gear before you think about getting out of the saddle to push, because again, we get some false feedback here from watching pros race or watching Tour de France riders. You shouldn't be thinking about accelerating and racing people up hills. You should be thinking about having your power as flat and as consistent as possible on the hills. And that's the best way to guarantee you're going to have a really decent run at the end of this. So get all the way to your easiest gear before you get out of the saddle, and only then get out of the saddle. I really want you having almost the feeling of, if you do have to get out of the saddle, do it with a mindset of, I'm going to ride up this hill as easily as I can, which leads us into point number 7. Point 7 is around pacing and conserving energy on the hills and how important this is. We really want you to avoid burning out early on a climb. And ideally, you're not going to have a change of breathing rate on the climb at any point. It's all going to be controlled by changing the gears and riding to the same effort the whole way up. You will hear people around you really, really out of breath who've gone too hard early in the climb. Don't let that be you. Change up the gears as we've described. And if you have to climb out of the saddle, once you've got to the point you're in your easiest gear, ride with the mindset of, I'm going to go as easy as I can up this hill. So don't be pushing really hard and trying to power up the hill. Almost you can think in your head that you're kind of almost doing a track stand in between pedal strokes. You'll need to practice this in training, because it takes a really confident rider to know that they can get up a hill and can control that feeling of going up a hill really slowly. And it's one of the skills people often don't practice, especially if they go out on group rides where it tends to turn into a race up a hill. Go out on one of your rides onto a steep hill and practice riding up it in an easy gear, going easy and getting to the top without feeling as though you're completely spent at the end of it. And we've already talked quite a lot about our pacing strategy for going up long, steady hills. What we're looking to do there ideally is just to maintain your power or effort or heart rate target on the hill, despite the fact it's going uphill. In a perfect world, we won't have your power go up, your heart rate go up. We'll just have you ride and your power meter effectively won't know that you're going uphill. That's the ideal situation to be in for long, steady hills. Okay, and point number 8, we've talked a lot here about our technique for going uphill and downhill for cycling. Let's talk about it for what we do on the run now. I want you to get to the run of your race feeling as though you can run really, really well. And that's the key reason we've spent so much time discussing the best strategy for maintaining energy levels on the bike. Once you're into running on the hills in your race, we need to have the best technique available to us. So the first thing here is your mindset. Accept that you don't have to slow down going uphill. Accept that you do have to slow down when you're going uphill. I misspoke there. Ideally, your heart rate doesn't change. If you're a runner that's a slave to a Garmin and you're always looking at the pace, it can be really tempting as you're running up a hill to check the watch and think, right, I want to maintain 5-minute Ks going up this hill. Effectively, what you're doing is you're putting in more effort and producing more power to go up the hill. What we're looking for is even effort, not even pace. So you are going to have to slow down as you go up the hill, at least 30 seconds per kilometer, probably a minute per kilometer if you're looking at the pace on your watch. Heart rate here is a really good guide to whether you're managing to slow down or not, because if you've been running at, I don't know, let's pick 150 beats a minute on the flat, you start to go up the hill, you are going to have to back that effort right back down so that you can maintain a heart rate of 150 beats a minute. So accept something has to change as you're going uphill, and that's not even on a steep uphill. I want it to maintain a good running form and maintain your running cadence. So think about running as tall as you can. Think about really driving yourself uphill. Think about moving your hands slightly higher up in front of you as you're running up the hill and trying to run tall and look up the hill where you're going, rather than something a lot of people fall into is looking at the ground in front of them and the head falls down, and that changes their run form completely. So run nice and tall, look up the hill where you're going, and think about trying to drive your hands upwards, which will help you go up the hill. You can use shorter, quicker strides on the really steep hills, but again, keep your eyes looking up that hill where you want to go, rather than looking at your feet or looking at the ground as you go up the hill. Now, a key part to this is going to be practicing the technique in training. Get out and run similar hills in training to what you're going to face on race day. If they're short and sharp, you need to do that in training. If they're long and shallow, you also need to do that in training. But get used to the idea that you can be the master of what your heart rate does on these hills. You can choose to slow down so that you're not going too hard and your heart rate doesn't rise too much. And that's the key part of controlling your effort on the running up hills. When you're running down hills, what I'd encourage you to do here is forget all about looking at your Garmin and just relax into the downhill and let gravity help. Now, it's really important that you practice this in training, because you'll find even on a relatively shallow grade going downhill, you can actually run quite fast for not very much effort. But be aware, your leg muscles, your quads in particular, are really going to have to absorb that impact as they're running downhill. It's eccentric loading for those physiologists out there. That means that the muscles are lengthening and absorbing the weight essentially at the same time. It's something that creates a lot of muscle damage. And so we have to train for it if we're going to race effectively doing this on race day. So be super, super aware of this. Build into this gradually. Don't do tons of fast downhill running to start with, but practice as you're out on these runs, relaxing into the downhills and just letting gravity help you on the way down the hill. And then that way, when it comes to it on race day, you'll naturally find you can relax into the downhills on the way down. But again, the key to this is to be successful at it on race day. You are going to have to practice these in training. There isn't really a way to simulate hills for running. You have to get out and run hills. And if you want to be successful on race day with a hilly race, you have to get yourself to somewhere you can run similar hills in training. Okay, so that brings us just about to the end of this week's episode. I hope that's been useful for you. I hope you're sitting there now with a ton of ideas of how you can get yourself confident and some training strategies that will really help you head forwards and get into good shape for both riding and running up hills and down hills, and go into your hilly races this year feeling really super confident. Before we wrap this up, here are some discount codes and deals for you. At precisionfuelandhydration.com, you can use the code OA23 for 15% off your first electrolyte order. And if you're looking for endurance coaching, triathlon coaching for this year, get in contact with us. There's a link in the show notes to book a call with me or the team, and we can chat about how we can best help you out reach your endurance goals this year. I think we've got the most comprehensive endurance sports coaching program for busy age groupers, no matter what distance or what event you're doing this year. Give us a ring and we'll have a chat about how we can both best help you out. All right, so remember, there's links in the show notes so you don't have to remember them. And if you can like and subscribe on YouTube and follow on your podcast player, that really helps out the growth of the show. Until next week, have a great, safe training and racing week. I'm Coach Rob Wilby, and you've been listening to the Oxygen Addict podcast. See ya.